Hey guys, this is Hellhades. This is going to be another Raid Shadow Legends video. Guys, we're going for video 2, back in the classroom, COVID lockdown with Hellhades. Today we're going to be talking about damage mitigation. Yesterday we did do more damage. Do you understand how to do damage in this game? Do you understand what you need to do to tweak your builds to get the most out of them? Today we're going to talk about what stops you doing your full potential of damage. How do you use that to your advantage, both in terms of pushing more damage and in terms of blocking your enemies hitting you? So, damage mitigation coming up. First thing to be aware of is that defense is not a flat, linear line. So, the more defense you put on does not necessarily reduce your damage by more percentage. You can see here it's a very much a curved line. Basically what it's doing is it's saying once you hit about 3k defense, your return of damage mitigation versus reward, I guess, for the defense you throw on is much less. Most people that are endgame will try and get 4k defense on defensive builds. So they're actually mitigating around 70 to 75% of all damage coming into them. So if you're trying to slam me for 100k and I've got 4k defense, I'm going to mitigate 75% of that. You're only actually going to hit me for 25k. Yeah. If you throw much more than that, so let's say we went right up to 5k defense, you got like 78%, and then you get an increased defense buff, which is another 60% on top of that, 50 or 60. Basically, what you're throwing it to then, 5 up to, call it 7.5 or so, you're only actually gaining an extra, 8 or so percent mitigation of all of that damage. So you do have to start asking yourself some questions. At what point do you want to stop adding defense into your builds, and at what point do you want to start switching the defense you're adding in for more offense? So let's talk about something else as well. The damage you can gain from wearing a Savage set. So what does Savage do? Savage ignores 25% of the defense of your opponent. So depending on how much defense your opponent has, this is kind of like the linear graph of when it starts to really gain some benefit for you. I'm going to go into a bit more around Savage set in this build because some will look at this graph and have no clue what's going on. Pretty much the rule is Savage is awesome unless you're fighting someone with less than about 1,000 defense. So almost always Savage is awesome. Almost always. Now, let's talk about the Kale example from yesterday's video where we were talking about doing more damage. So with Kale, we'd built a Kale with 3,000 attack and 180% crit damage. We then said you get a 50% damage buff from having increased attack up as a buff. We got an extra 10% crit from having a mastery plus crit damage. We got a 4.65 multiplier on his attack because that's what his A2 does. We then had 20% increased damage from books, 31% increased damage from masteries, 25% increased damage because our opponent had weaken on them, 20% increased damage because we had Bad L in our team, and 22.5% increased damage because we had Gerptuck in our team. That's a lot of stuff that you can just rip out because you probably don't have it, but you can kind of see how all of these things start to layer upon each other in terms of damage. And it ended up telling us that for our average hit against any opponent without any defense, we'd be striking them down for 175,000 damage. Now, when we then start to talk about damage mitigation, let's then consider what if our opponent we're hitting had defense. The first numbers there, 175,000, assumes there's no defense in the mix. So, if we're fighting someone who's got 4,500 defense as their base, let's go back to our defense curve, 4,500, they're actually getting about a 78% mitigation of that damage coming into them. So, we take our main number, we times it by 0.22, and we actually hit them for 38,562. So even with all those buffs, if we do not drop the defense of the enemy, they have got a huge damage reduction. Huge. Which is why when we're fighting harder levels in Doom Tower, Faction Wars, even like level 20 dungeons, and we're fighting against mobs with like 5k defense plus, we don't hit that hard unless we do decreased defense and unless we get some of these little shenanigans going on with our builds. So if we then take the same kind of setup, but we run it against a team that got decreased defense on. So decreased defense reduces their defense by 60%. We're reducing their defense by 60%. So if they've got 4,500, we take that number, we times it by 0.4, and they're actually going to have left 1,800 defense. So it's a big, big drop. Go to the 1,800 mark here. We're talking about mid-50s instead of mid-70s. It's a huge drop in defense. And in that instance, we've actually just increased our damage by over double. We've actually pushed it up to 78k per hit just from slamming them with decreased defense before KO gets his damage out. It's massive. And that's why whenever I talk about team building, I talked about one of the first people on the team sheet. It's your decreased defense champion. It does wonders for your damage. If we then look at the next kind of big one that we try and do, as certainly as endgame players, we try and get our people in Savage gear. I talked about it a lot. I go, it's probably more like an endgame setup, but the sooner you can get someone in reasonable level Savage gear, you start to do massive gains. You start to get massive gains. It's actually similar to Cruel gear. Cruel gear doesn't give you as much defense mitigation, but the idea is the same. So what you do though is you take whatever defense is left. So with Savage, for example, we've got 1,800 defense left after we've decreased defense. And then we're applying a further 25% decrease of the 1,800. So Savage straight up enables us to take the defense down to 1,350. 1,350 on the graph, starting to become weak source. And we're now hitting them for 92,370. Yeah? So we are almost half now of our original damage, but still enough to kill people. And that's why Savage and decreased defense are so strong together. So if we then talk about, well, what's better, Helm Smasher or Flawless Execution? And a lot of people ask me this. My default answer is always Helm Smasher unless somebody ignores defense already. That's my default answer. But here's why. So we've got the same setup, 175,000 worth of damage. We've already spoken about these different things, decreased defense, Savage gear, etc. But if we put Helm Smasher alongside Savage gear, if we got these two things working together, and the thing what Helm Smasher does is it ignores another 25% of your enemy's defense, provided it procs. And there's only a 1 in 2 chance of it proccing. But if it does proc, you take their defense down to 900. Go back to that original graph, 900. Paper thin is their armor they're wearing at that point. So yeah, we take their defense down to 900. It means that 64% of our damage gets through now. We're pushing most of it through. 2/3 of it is going through onto the enemy when it procs. So if we were to hit an enemy 10 times, and half the time it procs, half the time it doesn't, we would do damage of just over 1 million. 1,019,000. With Flawless Execution, we get a straight addition of 20% crit damage. So in the sum that we did originally, our hits on average would be hitting for 185,000 instead of 175,000. Still a decent improvement, to be fair, because what we've done is we've added an extra bit of multiplier into the crit damage part. So again, when we're going up against our enemy and we're wearing Savage gear with Flawless Execution, our hits on average are hitting for 98,091, which over the course of a 10-hit fight, Helm Smasher wins pretty comfortably. And that's with a kind of like 50-50 odds. So the rule of thumb is Helm Smasher hits harder across the board. But if you absolutely need consistency of damage, like in a campaign farmer, then the consistent hit is better than the weaker hits if Helm Smasher doesn't proc. So Flawless Execution for consistency and a dull life. Helm Smasher for the sexy smashes, is a general rule. But Helm Smasher over the course of a long fight will be doing more damage for you. So, just a rule to think about. Just a thing to leave you with in your head. The more defense your opponent has got left, the harder Helm Smasher wins by. So in that example, we'd really reduce the opponent's defenses by as much as we could. Savage Gear, decreased defense, yeah. In most examples, where you don't have Savage Gear and perhaps all of those other things going on, Helm Smasher wins by a country mile because there's more defense to take 25% off in the first place. So Helm Smasher wins by more, the more defense your opponent has. The kind of like nuances where it's pretty even are perhaps where you're fighting in the arena against a load of attack-based champions. They might only have a couple of K defense in the first place. You drop that defense by another 60%. They've got, barely any defense left. In that situation, Flawless Execution and Helm Smasher are pretty even. And when Helm Smasher doesn't proc, Flawless Execution goes way ahead. So that's generally the things to look out for. Now, there are some champions in the game which straight out mitigate damage. So a bit like Weaken, straight out increases your multiplier of damage by 25%. Someone like Norog, on his passive, Thick Skin, decreases the damage taken by all allies that are under one or more buffs by 15%, decreases the damage taken by allies that are under no buffs by 25%. It's exactly the same as Weaken. It's a straight up damage reduction mechanic. So basically what that means is, if you're facing a Norog, it doesn't matter how much you decrease his defense by, it won't affect this. It won't affect this at all. This is a straight up blocker of damage. It's actually one of the best damage mitigation skills in the game. There are others like him. So Duchess on her passive here as well decreases the damage taken by all allies from AoE attacks by 25%. Norog and Duchess can sandwich. They can actually scale on top of each other. So the only thing to be aware of though, whereas Norog is a straight 25% damage reduction, Duchess is a damage reduction of the amount of damage that is left. So if Norog reduces damage by 25%, Duchess will not then remove another 25%, making it 50. She will remove 25% of the 75% left coming at you. Still with me? Still with me? It's still good. It's still strong. She's also got a Veil mechanic, or Perfect Veil here. Perfect Veil straight up reduces damage that comes into you as well. So there's a lot of these type of different mechanics in the game. You need to know who you're fighting to understand which of those mechanics are coming in against you. So yeah, it's there's some really interesting different ones. So look, guys, a bit of a shorter one today. Damage mitigation is a really fun part of the game because you can make some really cool stuff happen. I've done a bunch of different bits and pieces on this in Clan Boss in the past. I guess look out tomorrow, guys, because if you're not finished with school yet, we've got one more day. Massive damage dealers. The weird champions, the ones that do stuff that absolutely blows things up. That's coming tomorrow. I hope you've enjoyed this series so far. I've been Hellhades. I'll catch you later.